when we look at chapter 2 in Ephesians, we find that Paul comes and he takes what was said in chapter 1 and he applies that further. He explains it in greater depth. Now, chapter 2 is broken up in 3 main parts, or that's how I see it. And that would be the first part where Paul comes and he explains what he said in the last part of chapter 1, where he declared that Jesus is actually establishing His kingdom in the earth since He is, or He has the power and the rule over all powers and principalities and so forth. And he explains what that means in the first part of chapter 2, when he takes the testimony or the fruit that is in the lives of the people in Ephesus, the Gentiles, and from that fruit he comes and he explains that what this rulership is all about and how Christ will rule in the earth and what will happen in the earth through this dominion that Jesus Christ has. And then we find in chapter 2, in the central part of this, talks about a unification. We need to understand that the theme of Ephesians so far is all about unity. Unity between heaven and earth. Unity between the life of God and the life of man, wherein God comes and brings forth His life in man and unifies man with God. So we find in the central part of chapter 2 that Paul takes this unity a step further, and it doesn't just talk about a unification between God and man, but he also talks about a unification between the 2 major people groups that there were on the earth, which were Jews and Gentiles. And he uses the law cleverly to explain this union from a law perspective, as well as then, since both people groups were under the law seen as sinners, he comes and he talks about the death of Jesus, and in the death of Christ, how these 2 groups are unified into one people group, and how this group can now be reconciled to God through the action of Jesus Christ, as well as that group then participating in that action through belief and understanding. We find in the central part of Ephesians 2 that Paul would come with what would be called by the Jews of that time an attack on the law system, which was not an attack at all. We need to understand that Paul was not against the law, but that he was for the law, but he could understand what the law was all about. He saw that the law and the purpose of the law was to bring all people before God as needy, in need of a Savior, and that this law would then prescribe what was needed in order for salvation to come to the world, and that Jesus came and fulfilled that. So Paul is not against the law. He loves the law. And the reason I believe he loves the law is because he could see what the law really is and what the law points to. Through the law, he saw that man can be unified, and the common ground was sin. Now we're going to look more at that as we go through this verse by verse. But we would find the central part of Ephesians talks about a unification between people groups. And we can find in the back of the mind of Paul lingering I would call the fatherly love for the church, when he wants to protect the church against the thorn in the flesh, which to the Apostle Paul was the Judaizers, the people that would come to the churches in Gentile areas and tell the Gentile people that they need to obey the law. And here Paul comes and he, in the central part of Ephesians 2, he comes and he gives the context of the law. And like I said, underlying in his mind the protection of what would still come to the church in Ephesus. Because the moment he would hear about the church in Ephesus, the first thing he would do is, I want to pray for you. I want your protection. I want you to understand what all this is all about in all wisdom and in all logic. Why would he say that? Because he also knows that Number one, through that understanding, they will have a greater experience of this truth. And number two, should the Judaizers come their way, that they will not be Judaized and fall from the grace of God back into the power of the prince of the air, which would be this whole thing about falling back into the flesh and back into sin and all of that. And then we find in the last part of Ephesians chapter 2 that Paul comes again with the underlying theme that there has been from chapter 1, and that is heaven and earth colliding, the place where the temple is, which was called that was the very presence of God, was in the most holy place, where he comes in the end of Ephesians and explains that that place is now the church, is the people of God. Let's get into chapter 2, verse by verse, and I know you're going to just enjoy this walk with me today. God bless.